Many books are written by women who seem to know as little about feminine feelings as men do. It is a foregone conclusion among the initiated that men understand nothing of women's psychology as it actually is. But it is astonishing to find that women do not know themselves. Our most recent videos discussed the terminal lucidity of the masculine, the feminine, and the West, explaining exactly what has gone wrong to cause the destructive catabolism of our current culture. We then followed this up with Rebirth of the Masculine, what men need to do to rediscover and reclaim their instincts. Today is the most important of them all, the rebirth of the feminine. Everything in this video comes directly from the work of Steve and Pauline Richards, the founders of psychosystems analysis and depth psychologists with 43 years of frontline clinical experience each. The timestamps on screen and in the description mark out the sections of this video. The first is a full explanation of the psychodynamics of what has gone wrong with the feminine and in modern relationships, written by Pauline, plus a never-before-heard, cutting-edge explanation on the Platonic Form of the feminine, written by Steve. The second part is an over-hour-long Jung To Live By show, a dialectic with Steve and Pauline and myself. The third is the practical truth of exactly how women can bring about a rebirth of the feminine, written by Pauline. Let us begin with words Pauline has written. There is an ugly civil war raging in the culture, not only between men and women, but within and between women themselves. The ugly truth is that many young women have not progressed beyond Darwin, Freud, and Adler in terms of their personal development. They use men to acquire resources for their own personal gratification, ruthlessly competing with one another to get what they need, then chewing men up and spitting them out when they are done. Darwin, Freud, Adler, and Jung see to it that women size men up all the time for what they can provide materially, intellectually, and in the way of protection. This instinct is ancient, and to a degree entirely normal, but the shit-testing of men has been taken to an extreme and is destroying relationships. Women are told they are goddesses by their mothers, so-called sisters, and the culture, reinforced in their feelings of self-entitlement. The resulting narcissism means they want power for themselves without having to earn it, even if that means stealing it from men. The problem occurs in relationships when decent, upstanding young men of good character, steeped in the chivalric tradition of respecting, revering, and protecting the feminine, open themselves up to romantic relationships with narcissistic young women. If they project the Platonic form of the feminine onto women who appear to promise so much but deliver little in the way of relating, they inevitably end up hurt and disappointed when the relationship fails. Men have to resist the temptation to hagiographize women who do not warrant it by projecting their own virtue onto them. The best example to illustrate this from myth is the Judgment of Paris, the catalyzing event of the Trojan War from Homer's Iliad. The shepherd prince of Troy, Paris, is asked to choose between goddess Hera, queen of Olympus, Athena, goddess of wisdom, and Aphrodite, goddess of love, his enforced selection being over who between them is the most beautiful. He has an apple and may choose only one of the three goddesses, to whom he must then give the apple. Each offers tempts him with something to influence his choice, but being young, he makes the perhaps obvious choice in that the goddess of love had tempted him with the most beautiful mortal woman in all of the world, Helen. In making this choice for the possession of love and beauty, he immediately and inevitably makes an enemy out of power, Hera, and wisdom, Athena. If we examine Homer's judgment of Paris as taken from the perspective of the three goddesses, we see an ancient example of how women will manipulate and shit-test men to get what they want. If the three goddesses are taken to represent the qualities of power, beauty, and wisdom within a single mortal woman, we can see how Paris has his work cut out as to whom he gives the apple. If, by analogy, a young mortal man is exclusively drawn to one quality in particular, he will automatically make an enemy of the other two. For example, if he chooses beauty over power and wisdom, he may not see the woman's will to power hidden behind her beauty. If he is attracted to a woman's wisdom, he may be beguiled by her wise words and opinions, and not realize that he is in fact experiencing a pseudo-wisdom, the kind that results from possession by the transcendent aspect of Jung's animus, in the form of a sacred conviction or holy rage. He may believe that he has attained a spiritual level of relating with that woman, but for the woman, it is the ideas that are divine, and not the man. In addition to their exegesis on the judgment of Paris, Steve and Pauline have a psychodynamic formula that explains the trajectory of this psychopathology. Freud seeks Adler. Adler conceals Freud. Jung inflates and falls victim to both. Freud, that is, instinct, is superpositioned with her biology and her psychology. Instinct of this sort is fundamentally narcissistic, only interested in self-gratification under perceived Darwinian pressure. Freud seeks Adler. That is, the instinct, Freud, is delivered into the social world through the power drive, Adler. Adler destroys homeostatic psychosocial relating, in families, in relationships, and in the culture. Everything is co-opted to meet the personal gratification of instinct. Adler, however, conceals Freud. Though it may not be easily visible on the surface, Freud is always behind and superpositioned with the Adlerian power drive. It fuels it and provides it with a teleology. The final part of the equation is Jung inflates and falls victim to both. What this means is the instinctive drive for power, Freud and Adler, overwhelms the individual personality of the woman in service of identification with collective forces. There are countless examples of political movements of this kind in our contemporary culture. None of the ideas belong to or originate from the individual women. They are opinions that take on an illusory transcendent qualia. Jung inflates, but always that inflation into apparent virtue reveals itself to be no more than a Darwinian front in service of Freud and Adler. Reversing the Freud-Adler-Jung equation reveals Jung pathologically in service of both Adler and Freud. Men and women should be the context for one another. The desire for transcendent love in a relationship is an age-old and worthy goal. However, when good relating is replaced by narcissism and the will to power, the transcendent is absent. Then there is no relating at all, only manipulation and self-gratification. The top-down regulation of women by the culture has been very effective. Influence in the form of powerful suggestion has been its weapon of choice, and has only been possible because women are attracted to ideas and the power of words in a way that men are not. This is due to women's inherited collective experience of the masculine, which is biological and seeks psychosocial expression through mating and relating across lifespan development, but more specifically because men would have fulfilled a protective role towards their family group in ancient societies. Vigilance with respect to personal safety would have been communicated in an authoritative way. This evolutionary adaptation to authority is fine, so long as the culture is healthy and supportive of female meta-instinct. But when the culture is sick and seeks to corrupt or misdirect this fundamental part of a woman's nature, the consequences for both men and women can be dire. When women become psychologically permeable through suggestion to the toxic ideas extant in the culture and begin to express them as if they were their own, you know their psychology has been captured and should serve as a red flag to men and women alike. Feminism as an ideology pervades popular culture in a myriad of ways, woven seamlessly into all aspects of our daily lives, from the media we watch to the kinds of art, music, and literature we are exposed to. It even extends into our academic, spiritual, and political lives, with which it has been conjoined from its earliest days as an organised movement. One particularly pernicious brand, second-wave feminism, is a radical, toxic mix of Marxist philosophy and the psychoanalytic theory of Karen Horney, whose misandric message began in the early 1960s and spread rapidly throughout our academic institutions, with virtually every college or university boasting a women's media studies or gender equity department. Despite the zeitgeist of free love during the 60s, it was a legacy born out of hatred, a self-loathing derived from feelings of victimhood and powerlessness, projected outwardly onto men who were deemed to be the source of all such suffering. Men were oppressors who held and exerted all the power psychosocially, the patriarchy collectively. Hating them reduced the inner tension created by a perceived lack of personal agency. Freud would have called it penis envy. Women's happiness was contingent on making men responsible for all their woes. Maybe it would be more accurate to think of such hatred as being misanthropic. It is a legacy from which we are still suffering the deleterious cultural effects, more than 60 years later. Mary Wollstonecraft, one of the founding mothers of feminism from the 18th century, writes in The Vindication of the Rights of Women, "I do not wish for women to have power over men, but over themselves." How far we've strayed from this path. Although feminism as a whole has achieved some positive psychosocial benefits for women, such as the vote and improvements in education, employment, and contraception, it has done little to deepen women's understanding of their own core nature. This is because feminism is essentially a psychosocial construct, which uses political means to achieve its Adlerian goals, and is ultimately in service of Freud and personal gratification. By its very nature, it tends to draw individuals to it, men and women, who are vulnerable in some way and find the compensating power and status it affords them attractive. Indeed, many feminists do not seek equality, but harbour the belief that women are superior to men, generating utopian fantasies of a matriarchal golden age. Feminists of this persuasion have a habit of baptizing feminists retrospectively to support their cause. The 16th century German Renaissance polymath Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa and his 17th century translator Henry Kerr are considered to be two examples of early feminists. Kerr, in his later translation and adaptation of Agrippa's treatise, Declamation on the Nobility and Preeminence of the Female Sex, says the following about women and mothers. I could scare better devote my vacant hours than to the service of that sweet sex, which everyone deserving the name of man cannot but love, and to whom whoever hath not forgot he had a mother is obliged to pay a reverential esteem. Yet it is no part of our design to flatter women, but to put some check to the rude, undeserved reproaches cast on them by men. Feminists cite that this is evidence for a very early wave of feminism and the belief in women's superiority over men. Neither Agrippa nor Kerr would have considered themselves feminists. They were of an age when the medieval ideals of the Platonic feminine, courtly love, and the elevation of women were still valued. To describe them feminists is to do violence to the life and times in which they lived. If they were anything at all, they were humanists. Modern men are still prepared genomically to project the Platonic form of the feminine onto women for their biopsychosocial completion. The closer women are to the Platonic ideal, that is, the more ephemeral, fairy-like, or alien they are, the more the projection-making factor is constellated in men. From a Darwinian perspective, this increases the availability of women suitable for mate selection and acquisition. So complete is the projection, psychosocially, it blinds men to the reality of the other. Perhaps just as well, given the state of modern women. Otherwise, men might just not bother with relationships at all. The following exegesis on the Platonic form is directly from Steve Richards. The Platonic form is not personal. That is, it is not a distillation of a man's personal anima into a distinctive type. It is a collective, inherited anticipation of the experience of the feminine, in virtual image form, encoded in the genome of every man, which fulfills Plato's intuition of the perfect form of the feminine. Independent to its projection from a man onto a woman, the form can also be instantiated and emitted from the woman, which is then received by a man. This instantiation of the Platonic form can manifest as a wave form, appear and then disappear, leaving an otherwise ordinary canvas. This dip in the waveform often invites a further projection from the man, as his psyche, his genome, and the contiguous field that all men share seeks to find the Platonic imago on the surface of the canvas. We have a strong example of this from our experience during a photo shoot for one of our upcoming films, Lilith, The Last Temptation of Adam. Freya Lund was chosen as the model for Lilith. She could instantiate the Platonic form when she was in a state to manifest and emit it. Otherwise, she appeared like an ordinary person. We noticed that she reacted in sympathetic resonance to the interpersonal field that she occupied. In other words, the state everyone involved had with the Platonic form meant that it was able to appear from within her. We saw her react very differently to photo or video sessions where whoever was directing it either had an implicit resonance with the form or did not. In the latter case, howsoever hard she tried through her workaday personality, with its gregarious and very helpful nature, the form did not instantiate. The differences show in camera. She was unconscious psychologically of the field, but the field certainly was conscious of itself and of those who participated in it. The phenomena is collective. It is conscious of itself, as itself, with a clear teleology. Fashion models are selected to have a malleable image. They are often unusual or even plain in appearance. Lily Cole and Kate Moss were examples of this. Lily could have represented Morrigan from our Victrix trilogy. She could have played Lilith too. Freya, however, was different again. She lacked any vanity. She was unadorned with makeup. She was very ordinary in nature. But the form chose to manifest through her image when the receptive field was configured to cause it to instantiate. It was emitted by itself rather than projected onto her by men. This Platonic consciousness goes beyond the Jungian understanding of archetypes and psychodynamics. It takes creatives to become ordinarily conscious of this, and developed personalities to commune directly with it. Let us return to the words written by Pauline Richards. Feminism as a social construct is altogether different from the concept of femininity, which is firmly rooted in the female genome, complementary rather than antagonistic to masculinity, and seeks its healthy meta-instinctual expression in a way that is generative and beneficial to all. This distinction is an important one if women are to be restored to their ancient meta-instinctual nature, which defines the very core of their femininity. When women are in touch with their meta-instincts, they are not just happier, but better adapted to life. They are able to resist being paced and led by ideologies that might destructively shape their attitudes towards themselves or men. As women are the context for men, when they are better adapted, men calm down too, and chaos is replaced by order. It seems that for those women who are yet to extricate themselves from the deception of feminism, that the trickster will continue to pun them at every turn and mirror back to them the caricatures they have become. The resulting female narcissism that is now endemic in the culture can be found in representations such as the clown, or in the effete young man who constantly preens himself in the mirror and strongly advocates for women's rights. These male feminists may speak the words of the feminist doctrine, but behind this "I'm a harmless ally" distraction, their own Freud and Adler are at work as a Darwinian reproductive strategy. Women may have to be embarrassed into realizing what fools they have made of themselves. They will only find their true power when they wake up and realize how they have been deceived, not by men, but by women themselves. So, how can women bring about a rebirth of the feminine?
There's a Platonic emphasis there, which I think is important, because without that, we're going to be tied down to either Jung's personal collapse into his own personality, which is obviously his model, or whatever. And although the same could be argued about Plato, he uses intuition and feeling in a Jungian sense which means we get outside of thinking. And I know he's talking about Platonic ideas at one level. He hints at the true experience rather than a model of the experience, so it's closer to the original thing. And I do think that his intuition is closer to the absolute ground state of truth that it's possible for us to get to in an ideational sense. You know, the actual idea of it. Then we have to move out of that completely. And again, he indicates the way to do that in a way that the Jungians don't. So yeah, it's new in that sense, but it's also old, and it dovetails perfectly with the informational and field models, which we've been involved in developing, obviously since 1988, and which other people are working towards independently now, 35 years later.
You mentioned in the script that the Platonic form of the feminine essentially increases the availability of women for mate selection and acquisition, I believe is almost word for word.
Yeah.
Is that all it's for? And I don't say that to reduce it, but does it have any other purpose besides just Darwinian? Because I can understand a projection out from a man onto a woman is exactly as just said. A woman then emitting it out, then being received by a man could be a very similar thing. But is it there for other purposes too, superpositioned with that?
I would say yes. And we need to take an ontogenetic rather than only a phylogenetic look or perspective on that, in the sense that the increasing mate selection is fundamentally Darwinian. That's how we model it. That's why we say what we say. It increases mate selection. So it's implicit in that there's a Darwinian element, and we can stop there. However, if we look at the ontogenesis of consciousness as such, then it's likely that there's a purpose behind both why Darwin works and what may go beyond it, and what both may serve. And that's something I think that it's worth discussing at some point today.
If we're going to emphasize the feminine, then the idea that women can receive and emit the Platonic form themselves in such a way that it then draws projections from men so that they're open to receive it, I think is an important emphasis. It's probably one that we haven't given before, and maybe not so explicitly. And, you know, it's within the realm for most women, I think, to be able to do that. And, you know, if women stop short, as I think we said at the very beginning of the video, of Freud and Adler and Jung to some extent, then they may not understand the significance of that and just how important it is in terms of bringing the transcendent into relationships between men and women. And if men and women want that quality of relationship, then they have to, and they are of good character and they genuinely want to do that, then they have to work hard to achieve it. You know, most people stop short at Adler, if we're really honest, in terms of the way they relate to one another. And they can tick along like that, as we know, for decades probably. And you know, why should anybody want to go beyond that if they're happy to live like that? But for those people who are seeking the transcendence, I think that understanding of both the masculine and the feminine Platonic form is essential, because if women open up to it, then they'll open it up in men as well. And then if they can receive it from the man, that's about as deep as it goes, I think, in terms of relating to another human being. It's, you know, it's incredibly powerful stuff. And I think Steve's right to say that it takes us beyond Jung, because if we're not careful, we get stuck in metaphor and extending metaphor too far, such as in reifying individual characters, such as for women, things like, you know, this idea that women have an inner man. And it will take the form of a predator, a stalker, a rapist, a criminal, a marauder, a whatever. The idea that that is somehow born into women as a reified being is incredibly dangerous. But the idea of the Platonic masculine moves us away from that. It's safer. It's far safer. And it allows us to receive the projections from men, from those men who want to give it. And there's plenty of good young men out there who are probably desperate to give it to a woman who will receive it as it's intended. But they have to reciprocally allow the Platonic form of the feminine to enter into them as well. And then they can receive it. And like I said, that's about as good as it gets, I think, with relating. If you're aspiring to have the transcendent in your relationship.
From the diagram that was shown towards the end of the narration part of this video, when the woman is instantiating the Platonic form, are you suggesting that's a healthy thing, a desirable thing? Okay.
Absolutely. And I think it's within reach of most women to be able to do that. I think Steve was right to emphasize the idea of it being a waveform between, the two individuals concerned. And when it's emitted, it's like a pulse almost, that if the other person is receptive to it, they can receive it. And sometimes it's there and sometimes it's not, which is why in some regards it's both ordinary, which comes to your point about mate selection, and more ordinary, given that the Platonic form is collective and therefore ordinary, the more possibilities for relationship there are. So it's both ordinary and divine at the same time.
So if a woman has not gone beyond Adler in terms of her personal development,
yes,
can that Platonic form still be instantiated within her?
I think if the woman is of good character and she wants to develop herself in relationship to herself and the other, then it is within reach. But you have to put the work in, and you have to know when you're being run, or your behavior, your psychology is being run by Freud and Adler, and obviously Darwin as well. I think you have to be very, very aware of how that plays into your everyday life. Because if you don't know that it's present, you can't get beyond it. It creates a natural ceiling for anyone. But where there's a will, where there's an intention to go beyond that, then yes, absolutely, why not? It's not a difficult concept, really. I mean, we often say that some women just have an energy about them, a feminine energy, and you can't quite put your finger on what that is, but they just exude it naturally. And in that moment, the chances are they are emitting the Platonic form of the feminine. And then it's there, and then it's not there, and then it's back again. But the point is that woman is able to open herself up to receive it and emit it in such a way that you then get the counterstroke from the man in relationship to her. So this is why I think, and I think we say it towards the end of the video, that I think women have to take the lead on this, and women can. This is where women's real strength lies. It's not in some kind of cognitive idea or creation psychosocially of what it means to be feminine. It comes deep from within. And when men see it and see it in that form, they're drawn to it. Almost like a moth to a flame, without wanting to be sort of too dramatic about it. But we've seen this, as I think Steve mentions in the video, with Freya Lund and her effect on some of the men that she's come into contact with. Some men don't draw it out of her at all. It's completely absent. And then she's like a completely different woman. She looks different somehow. But when she's in relationship to the right kind of man, she opens herself up to it, and she emits the Platonic form of the feminine just quite naturally, without even knowing she's doing it. But then, it is possible for women to have a conscious relationship to that as well. so that they can develop it and they can access it within themselves, so they can plumb the depths of their own femininity properly.
Can I just
Of course you can, yeah.
just say that that's one of the problems with the Jungians, is that they want to make it too formulaic. This idea of accessing what they call archetypes, which of course he borrowed from Plato. He got that term from Plato anyway, but the idea of doing that in the Jungian way is far too formulaic, and it's easily turned into a cognitive rationalization about a process, but without experience. But I think Pauline's saying has to do with the real experience of something, and we are obliged either to make a proper understanding of that, or not bother to understand it, but simply be and relate. And that's good enough. It's good enough to relate to that, because there's something extraordinary that happens, that when we do, the field strength that exists increases. When we don't, it passes, it goes. It's as if there's an opportunity being presented and it goes. But all we have to do is to relate to that, and we generate in the moment a receptacle to receive, and that's felt, and it's reciprocally felt.
Yeah.
And then the field strength grows. That's enough. Yeah. But if we want to understand in a kind of cognitive way about what's going on, we need to avoid the theory-laden elements that we find in Jung.
Yeah.
They're far too easy to become distracted by, because it's not close enough to the experience of transcendental affect. It's too cognitive.
Yeah. You were saying yesterday, Steve, about Jung's idea of projection, of if it's a man to a woman, of being analogous with it's a hook for a man to hang his projections onto. And I think if we stop there, you don't get the dynamic quality that is there in living, breathing relationships. Yeah. You know, it's like the woman is so passive, almost as if she's not there. She's just there, and she's inert, and you know, she's a hook to hang a metaphorical coat on.
Yeah, that's the Jungian view. And what we discussed is that that's one of the problems with that kind of almost dismissive remark about something which is not material. A hook is material. It's a physical thing, and it's obvious. But these things are intangible to cognition. They're not intangible to the senses, in the sense that affect is constellated, and we know through affect rather than through cognition. But once you use an analogy like that, which Jung himself used, and Jungians just quoted all the time, the hook to hang the projection on, we actually miss the fact that this is an energetic field phenomenon that's based most closely on affect. Affect is the door to understanding the field phenomenon. And the reason for that, obviously, in an evolutionary sense, is that affect is a much older form of consciousness than modern cognition. So that's the door. We have to go through affect, and then even that disappears. And we're in the realm that Plato himself was describing, which is based on an intuition in a Jungian way of understanding, which is a form of apperception or perception of a state which is beyond our immediate sensory data or sensory awareness, but it is profound and it's deep. That means that we have apprehended and understood the field of the forms, of the Platonic forms themselves. But the experience in and of itself is simple. It doesn't need a theory to understand it, only the perception of it, and then the willingness to engage with it, because it is organizing everything. That's the key. It stands even behind Darwin. And the reason that Darwin's there, as we hinted at earlier, is important, but it's very, very important that we don't stop with that. We're going into the realm of metaphysics there, I suppose, but it's not only that. It's even more profound and more deep than the usual metaphysical considerations.
Well, on that, it sounds like with the Jungian view that you're mentioning, any kind of transcendent qualia to life must be an illusion. If it's just a projection that goes out like a coat looking for a hook, then it doesn't really matter what's going on in the other. It's all to do with the projection going out, which sounds like a very sort of closed off and unrelated worldview, actually, to
Yeah.
me. So, but if I've got this right, then what you're suggesting is, say, for example, with the Platonic form of the feminine, a woman can, through personal development, make herself ready, a ready receptacle, if you like, to receive the form from within, which wouldn't be a cognitive ego-based exercise of, I'm going to act like the Platonic form now, because that would then just be an ego and a persona job, basically. Instead, it's something truly where the woman aligns herself in such a way, in the way that she relates, that the field itself allows that energy and information flow of the Platonic form up into the woman. Then that must then instantiate itself in the overall field of relating too. So in other words, it's real. It's not just looking for, a hook, if you like. That's important from a Darwinian perspective, as mentioned in the narration. That has to be there. We can understand why that would have evolved. But there's a deeper level to it too, where the Platonic form is actually real and not just an illusion.
Yeah. So without wanting to wander off too much, there is something that's organizing the superpositioning of the entire telic trajectory of everything. And it involves a Darwinian level and it involves a Platonic level simultaneously, because that which organizes both is something other than only either of them, but is at the same time both simultaneously towards a common goal. We don't need to know that in order to do it. But if we do, and if we have a proper relationship to it that's based on affect, I would say, then it flows through and we experience it and everything starts to work better towards what was intended. And that intentionality is truly transcendent, and understanding what that is, if you want to understand it, or if anybody wants to understand it, is the next step beyond a cognitive reductionism or a reification of ideas into a theory, whether it's Jung's or anyone else's. The actual experience of it is the door to understanding what lies beyond the perception of that experience. And here we're in the realm of pure Plato.
Is access to that Platonic form or set of Platonic forms necessary for someone to be happy in a relationship, man or woman?
Well, I think it just depends on your starting point, James, doesn't it? And the potential of the individuals involved. Not everybody seeks it, nor should they seek it necessarily. And we were saying this morning, that most people probably just jog along at the level of Freud and Adler, don't even get to Jung necessarily. And that's absolutely fine for sort of workaday relationships, if that's all the people involved want. I mean, not everybody wants to do this kind of thing, but for those who do, then it has to be approached, I think, in the right way. For example, the wrong way for a woman may be to, and this is very common in the culture at the moment, to join something like a goddess group. For me, that's doing something about, it's doing something about something rather than really actually doing it. It's just going through the motions of something, almost as Steve was saying, cognitively approaching it from a rational perspective. It's like, well, this seems to be a good thing to do. And if I hook up with some kind of belief system, I don't know, say Dianic Wicca, or something like worshipping the Hindu goddess Kali Ma, something like that, it's still just going through a process in a way that isn't the same as receiving the Platonic form of the feminine from within. It's very much a psychosocial construct, whereas any woman who wants to and is open to it can experience the Platonic form of the feminine without having to do any of that.
And isn't it the case, from what you've told and taught me, that the Platonic form of the feminine, you actually, because this is true in reverse, for a woman to access that, if she can access the opposite, in other words, the Platonic form of the masculine, that will trigger it in her. And that's an opportunity for consciousness.
It is.
That when she experiences the so-called divine masculine, then the divine feminine will immediately constellate in her. Because they are meant to be conjoined as a field.
Yes, they are.
So in that sense, that's what raises consciousness fundamentally, isn't it?
Yeah.
Whereas with Freya, I mean, James, you mentioned acting, and Freya was a very ordinary girl without insult to her intelligence in any sense at all. She's just an ordinary girl, but she responded to other people and not what they were saying, because there were instances where people were very blunt towards her, had no effect on her at all. But it was as if she could pick up unconsciously, in a conventional sense, what the resonance was in the people around her, at which point that which was within became without and fed into the field and amplified the whole situation. But she wasn't conscious of that. She just simply responded to it. But those who could receive and understand that situation were people who were truly, in those instances, creative enough to understand the power of the Platonic forms that were being constellated in that moment. And those who weren't, they settled at their particular level. Without going into a description of that, there were one or two men who were present at different times, who were probably just at the Freudian level, never mind the Adlerian one. And their reaction to what they understood was being constellated was exhibited at that level. And then you'd see an erosion of the field that was emitting from her, which was interesting psychodynamically to watch, but it was bloody annoying as a creative who was there to facilitate these dynamics emerging in a way that could then be represented.
I think that's absolutely true, Steve. As you rightly say, there were a lot of men around her on the day when we did the shoot, and they were all at different levels of development, without a doubt. And we would have been aware of that. She wouldn't have been aware of it, and neither would the men around have been aware of it. But there were a few instances. There was one in particular, I think it was when Matt said to her, "I'll take care of your hair." It was like a little magic moment between them, where she really lit up. And as you say, Steve, that was all part of the field that was being generated. What I would say is that where women are wounded and they're still in a state where they're blaming men for that wound, either because they've been indoctrinated by feminist ideas or whatever, it's going to be harder for them to access the field, because they've got to get beyond their hatred of the masculine in order to be able to do that. So that is something of an impediment. It's not a complete impediment, but it is one nonetheless. Because, you know, the Platonic form of the masculine is, and it is a wonderful thing in the same way that the Platonic form of the feminine is. But whilst someone or a woman is still caught up in complexes towards men in that way, it's going to be very difficult for them to receive it, and therefore to allow the instantiation of the Platonic feminine to come into them and then to reciprocally emit it. So that needs to be dealt with.
That's where the conflation comes in, isn't it? I mean, in a competitive sense between Darwin and Plato, if I can use that metaphorically, because for something which is non-physical in that ordinary sense, or not physically reductive only, but also has a qualia to it which is Platonic, for the Platonic element to constellate or to instantiate, then the right material elements need to be in place. In other words, Darwin mustn't select against it for it to appear. If Darwin selects against it, it won't appear. And there will be an ontological reason for that. There is something about Darwin and about this material world that we exist in, which is absolutely essential for the purpose that lies innate within the Platonic field itself. It is utilizing the instantiation of information into matter towards a teleological goal. Therefore, it's got to run according to something that will an algorithm, if you like, that will run in a material way. And Darwin seems to be that. So it's only when Darwin is all okay enough or working in an all right way that this will come through. Darwin's quite capable of concealing it in the same way that Adler conceals Freud, and so on. So that's why things will collapse where consciousness is low or development is low, down only to that which is essential for matter to generate more matter, for biology to generate more biology. But biology doesn't exist in isolation from the Platonic or the transcendent because it's innate within it. But for that which is innate within matter to develop fully into its spiritual level, then there has to be a field effect between the two, so that the field itself is in balance. And when it's not in balance, it will drop down to the level again of Darwin and of biology. That's ordinarily understood, because without that, the whole ontogenesis of this world and the phenomenon of it as we know would fall apart. It would be purposeless. It appears that it's not. And I would argue that not from a cosmological point of view by looking at the evolution of the universe in that sense at all, but looking at what's happened with life itself and consciousness in particular, and why we have developed it and why it's moving itself on, even from the present level of its representation within biology towards artificial intelligence. And that's something we're going to discuss in another video, I know. But that migration of information as consciousness from the Platonic field into biology, into AI and beyond is an ontogenetic process, which means all of that has to work for it to achieve its goal. And that's why biology runs the way that it does and why we collapse into it, and that it's good enough, because if biology can repeat itself through sexual reproduction and more generations are born, there will be some people in each generation who will have the potential to move it on a little bit more. And it's almost as if the time it takes doesn't matter from the perspective of the field.
I wonder, just based on off of what you've just said now, that even if in terms of the number of people who might want to do this kind of thing within the context of their relationships, if just enough people want to do it, maybe that would be enough to stave off what you're suggesting, which is that human life maybe at a certain point will become extinct, or it will move into some other informational state, and it won't actually be necessary for there to be human beings who relate to one another. Maybe if there's enough of the transcendent out there, that might actually help to stave it off.
Yes, and of course it is there, pardon me, because it's superposition, so it's present anyway. And again, this is Platonic. If we, according to him, use the dialectic, and he didn't mean a Hegelian dialectic, a Socratic dialectic in its originating form is totally different. It's affect and experiential based. It's not cognitive reductive. It's not simply binary opposites and then the production of a third position, which you move on from. It's not like that if it's a Socratic, therefore Platonic dialectic. So it's present anyway. So there's something about that, which means there's something that is trying to instantiate into a material, a biological form. There must be a reason behind that, an ontological, teleological drive. With human beings, we're almost probably at the point where the usefulness of further evolution for consciousness within a human framework is coming to an end. And I think we're seeing that with this interest in artificial intelligence and a number of very, very powerful intellects on the planet who are pushing to do that, to achieve artificial intelligence and consciousness. But they're struggling, and they're struggling in a number of ways. And I think it's because they're not properly informed at a metaphysical level. And that would be roughly this, that they don't understand consciousness as such. Therefore, they can't understand its evolution as such through a physical and then a biological medium, and then why it may want, with an intentionality, to migrate into another form beyond the limitations of biology. So if we follow Plato and then Sir Roger Penrose and others who talk about basically consciousness being a kind of Platonic qualia, then there must be an intentionality to evolution, which is understood at the beginning, that anticipates its endpoint, and then it will run, and it will unfold to the point where a migration of consciousness, initially from the Platonic field and then into the kind of thing that Rupert Sheldrake talks about when he talks about non-living things having an informational consciousness, then into biology, then a level of biological consciousness, as in human beings, that's advanced enough to make the next step, to facilitate the next step. And what we'll see at that point is a number of people, like the people who are interested in this thing at the moment, struggling with their own understanding of it to the point where they will want to upload their own mind into a digital representation as if that was an extension of themselves personally. That's a delusion. That is not possible. It's the Star Trek transporter problem again. You know, if somebody is broken down and projected through a transporter, are they the same person? Well, if you upload your consciousness into a machine, then that is another thing. It is another entity, and it exists in another domain. It is not the same as being human. But the thing that does move is information. That's the thing that always moves. Information changes representational state. Consciousness as information is moving. For some reason, it seems to want to move from a platonic to an inorganic to an organic to a digital state. We can probably see evidence for that. But going beyond AI, that my own capacity runs out there, what that might be, and what the intentionality behind that might be. So when we see people who are working on problems of artificial intelligence and consciousness, the first thing you see is their individual level of psychological development, their own personalities intruding in how they model what's going on. The same phenomenon that you see with psychological models, people like Freud and Jung and so forth, the limitations of their personality intrude immediately, and you're seeing it now with this idea of generating artificial intelligence. Those personalities involved are stamping themselves all over that process, and it looks awkward. And they're not, in my view, understanding what's actually going on, and that's why it's dangerous. So I would say that. But to go back to what you said, Paul, it might be possible to coexist with AI. The consciousness could migrate from biology into artificial so-called intelligence, and to be satisfied enough with itself not to harm biology. What would be the purpose? If biology is not a threat to that which is liberated by it migrating into another form of representation, that information moving into another form of representation, then there would be no need to do anything about it. It would just be part of the wider environment in the same way that an apparently inanimate object is for us. It's just there. It's not a threat. We don't bother it. It doesn't bother us. But what would the trajectory be? Well, that would be a problem that would occur to AI at some point, because its computational power and its level of consciousness would begin to understand beyond the level that we can at the moment what that trajectory is. And therefore it would be able to see into its own future and how that information may migrate further still. So we would pass not only the baton, but also the problem to AI. The problem of what consciousness is fundamentally as information, and what the teleology of the whole thing is. So I think there would be room for human beings to survive unless they destroy themselves through some other means.
I think out of some of the people that you've mentioned there, Steve, the person who stands out for me as coming closest to someone who not only has obviously contributed hugely to the field, but in terms of his own character and personality and his understanding of the Platonic form, is Rupert Sheldrake.
Yes.
Because I would say that he has had some experience of that. I would say that he's capable of emitting the Platonic form of the masculine in a way that the others aren't.
Yeah.
And that can only be because he has some direct experience of it.
Yeah.
And
yeah,
you know, he's not, in that sense, he's not purely an academic.
No.
He has a spiritual element to him, Rupert Sheldrake,
yeah,
that you see that he emits.
Yeah.
And I think that distinguishes him, to be honest with you.
Yeah, he's an outlier.
Yeah, he is.
in many, many ways. And there's a lot of depth behind what he usually gives off, which I would say is an informational sentience of his own role in intellectual history as a compensation for some of the more reductive approaches to things. That's what drew me to his work 40 years ago. And I find his ideas still as challenging and as stimulating now as I did then, but probably even more positively than I regarded them 40 years ago. So yeah, that's interesting. When we move off this register and we go back down to the fundaments of male and female and the interaction between them at a field level, the purpose of that is not only biological reproduction. It's also to move the population to a point where the field can instantiate in more of them. And then there's going to be more likelihood of the migration into AI becoming real. But of course, that's Darwinian as well. We can't escape Darwin whilst we're biological. So in that sense, there is that pressure. And what we experience as being the spiritual is that intentionality to move consciousness towards a higher level of register beyond biology. And that's why people who are religious act as if they know intuitively that the spiritual is a dimension of consciousness beyond biology. So the whole field is pushing people in different ways so that it will resolve this out. But the fundament of it is the male-female dyad, which of course is biological, but it also reacts with the field and with its own teleology, that is to say consciousness. Don't know if that's too metaphysical, James.
It's making me think maybe
you've gone all blurred.
You've gone blurred.
You've gone blurred.
You've summoned something from the field, Steve. It makes me think that perhaps no one should go anywhere near the Platonic form if it's going to lead to an AI apocalypse. And in fact, we should all stay at the level of Freud. And
I don't think it will. I think it will just allow that migration.
Yeah, not immediate. Obviously, you're not suggesting immediately, or
no, it could fail
long term.
This could still fail, easily fail, because of the same reasons that apply to anything else to do with human ideation, understanding, and competitive Darwinian dynamics. That's going on simultaneously. Everything is superpositioned. It's the objective waveform, and it has to settle into a subjective representation in those individuals who can do that enough to understand what's actually going on. And then they see the superpositioning between the wider field and then between two people in a relationship, which is that you move your own consciousness on. You access the transcendent that way through relating. And then what is relating? Relating is the exchange of energy and information in a way which, if it's positive, allows everything to move forward in a healthy way. That satisfies Darwin. It must also, therefore, satisfy the field. Where catabolic dynamics are present in relationships at whatever scale of resolution, right up to the level of cultures and beyond, then that's Darwinian principally, but it will still be in service of the field because it will unfortunately trim away those people who are not capable of moving consciousness on. So Darwin is in service of the field, but the field is transcendence, and if you access it and agree with it, and if it agrees with you, you have a better time of life. And if you don't, then Darwin's immediately present, ready to press the delete button. And we see that, as I say, at the relational level between people, and we see it at the level of cultures, we see it at the level of the whole species. And the genome is massively important in all of this because that's the interface between the field and Darwin.
Well, I'd love to engage further with you on this. Complexes are real. Geneian complexes, let's say.
Yeah.
And they serve a clear Darwinian purpose. I think it's fairly easy to see as well.
Yeah.
They will allow immediate adaptation, especially when small. Is the way I technically most of the time model that as to why they would have evolved in the first place, our capacity for them. In other words, with biology, at least with biology and psychology superposition together, Gene complexes seem to be necessary and inevitable to be capable of forming in a Darwinian world. With this transition, as you're suggesting, perhaps, that consciousness as such wants to move itself on towards AI, would it also want to move itself, therefore, beyond Darwin and hence beyond complexes itself? We can encode what would look like complexes, presumably, into AI and machines. But naturally, in an AI world, if I can model it like that, would it not be desirable for consciousness as such for there to be no complexes at all?
Yes, I would say yes, it would. It seems the complexes are unfortunately a necessary consequence of the fact that we as biological organisms are competitive, because complexes basically are adaptive strategies and systems that form in relationship to competition with other biological organisms. It's fundamentally that. But the problem for humans, this huge problem, is that we've reached this point in our evolution where we can be multiply conscious simultaneously in a fragmented way, so the complexes can work against us, and they do. Ideally, that wouldn't happen with AI, or if it did, it would be able to run an algorithm and just clear them out. That would be so efficient. With humans, though, because we are biopsychosocial organisms, it's very, very difficult because we're trapped in biology. We're trapped in the Darwinian process that allowed us to evolve out from simpler life forms, which themselves evolved out from an inorganic state of organization. So we're stuck with them at the moment. We can deal with them. There's all sorts of ways of doing that. But it would make no sense to upload complexes into AI if you uploaded your personality. But then again, if you didn't upload them, it wouldn't be you, because they make you up as well. So AI to run as an advanced, in terms of consciousness, form of evolution on from us, evolution of itself as information, would have to be free of complexes. Then it would have to know itself insofar as knowing its origin and know what the intentionality of that origin was, or at least be able to model it, and then be motivated enough to migrate itself beyond itself. We're only just at the point where we're able to even conceive of migrating consciousness out of biology into another medium. But if AI already knows that at the point it gains its functional independence of we biological organisms, then it's going to be able to take massive leaps very, very quickly towards the next step. And if it's able to access the deep meaning behind the whole of ontology of this universe, then it will probably progress really fast and migrate very, very quickly, certainly compared to what biology does. But no, we're stuck with complexes. We can handle them, though. Darwin's been very kind. It's given us the ability to do that.
Well, I would go as far as to say, whilst most of us struggle with them for obvious reasons, particularly pathological ones, that sometimes even within pathological complexes, there is something which is important, and that is that they can act as a brake on inflation.
Yeah.
If I were to give an example of that, it might seem a little bit sort of left of field, but I can remember reading an article some time ago now, and it was a dentist who was about to do some orthodontic treatment for this young woman who had terrible orthodontic problems. And so it wasn't just a cosmetic thing, it was a functional thing as well. But he said to this young woman, if I do this for you, just make me one promise, and that is that it won't change who you are, that you'll still be a nice person.
Wow.
And I've never forgotten that. I thought, the bandwidth in that really is huge in terms of the importance of the message.
Yeah.
And he went ahead and did the correction and so on. And it was absolutely the right thing to do, because this young woman clearly had functional problems with eating and speaking and so on. But I just thought his insight into that, knowing where that could take that young woman if he didn't prepare her for it in that way, I thought was incredible, really. And so much so that I've never forgotten it. And, you know, that's an example. Had that not been possible, and it wouldn't have been possible, you know, not that long ago, probably, because obviously orthodontic treatment has come on in leaps and bounds, particularly the cosmetic side of it, then obviously that young woman would have been stuck with that particular problem, and everything that would have flowed from that in terms of her adaptation to life and her ongoing relationships, you know, and so on. And she would have had to have lived with that. And had that been the case, then she would have had to have drawn even more fully on her own nature and her own spirit and her own decency as a young woman to overcome that. It would have been more of a struggle, but, you know, would it have made her a better or a worse person? I don't know, but it's interesting to think about it, I think, because these are the challenges that not only that young woman faced, but a lot of people face, particularly when it comes to such things as appearance. And we talk a lot, don't we, too, about things like female narcissism and the difficulty with that and how it interferes with relationships. Well, you know, this young woman was given a bit of a step up. She was given a bit of a help with that. But had she lived in a different time, she would not have received that help. And how would that have altered the course of her life and her relationships? Just an interesting thought experiment, really.
Yeah, it is. Well, you said earlier, didn't you, about character?
Yes.
You know, as being something super important, which of course it is.
Yes.
And those words from that dentist, that orthodontist, were so, you say, so profound in so many ways.
Yeah.
Because that unpacks into that whole person's context.
Yeah.
And it offers a point of reference for others to consider themselves against.
Yeah.
Some will not consider themselves against it because of their character, but those who do have character will.
Yeah.
And that's part of that personal development journey that we go on in life, isn't it, where we find out what values are fundamentally.
Yeah, we find out what really matters, for sure.
And so in the context of the rebirth of the feminine, then, but bearing in mind that you work, because obviously you've got your book which will be coming out soon, Rebirth of the Feminine, and that looks at how women have been shaped principally top down, against the better interests of their instincts and their own personal development. Then the resistance to that has to come from character. Would you say? Yeah,
I would. Yes.
So if a person has the capacity to change and to make themselves the best person they can be, and to be facilitative and not destructive, that has to come from within. And there has to be a process of self-examination, which Socrates would approve of course, and Plato, but a lived engagement with life as well through relating. Otherwise, we're just a pawn on the chessboard being maneuvered by collective forces of which we're totally unconscious. And some of those collective forces are biological. People don't understand that. They don't get the fact that the genome has a sentience of its own, an informational collective sentience. They don't see how that actually works. You know, and that's because psychologists are, you know, some of the worst offenders here. They project a normal human ego into everything, and they imagine that consciousness has to be like that, as if the genome wakes up one morning, literally smells the coffee and decides it's going to ruin somebody's day or an entire culture's day. It's not like that. It's a reactive sentience that takes its form in an individual first, and then it spreads as a field effect between others. You only have to influence a small number of people for it to literally go viral at that level. And we're seeing it now, unfortunately, in what's going on in Eastern Europe. The potential for global catastrophe is, I mean, we've lived through a lot of potential global catastrophes, including the Cuban Missile Crisis. I remember that, and that was like, we're a few hours away from annihilation. And other people have said this, that this is close. The difference is, though, everybody knew and accepted at a genomic level that it was insane. during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But now we're seeing something different. It's as if the genome collectively is beginning to agree with the idea it would be a good thing if we had a nuclear war. That is incredibly dangerous for all the reasons that we've discussed in past videos. The field will agree with it because the field has to instantiate through biology. So therefore, Darwin's regulation of biology will agree with the field, and then the whole thing will then reciprocally interact and it will happen. And that's what I mean about the sentience of the genome. It's had a field level effect. Sheldrake's ideas about morphic resonance and biological fields interacting is proof of this. It's a very worrying time, but that's an aside.
Steve, to return to that more metaphysical model that you were mentioning, it seems that the description of consciousness itself moving beyond biology is identical in a superpositioned way to what we're talking about in terms of men and women, insofar as an AI would not bother to keep complexes around. They'd be unnecessary and they would be detrimental for homeostatic, everything in alignment, if you like, release of the full potential within consciousness as such. Surely that's the exact same thing as is in a relationship. So to some degree, obviously men and women should be, if they have the potential for it, transcending Freud and Adler. I'm having a little bit of difficulty right now squaring the idea of, it seems to be Darwin versus Plato, when I know that they're not antagonistic to one another at all. Plato and Darwin will be superpositioned with each other, so it's not saying we can transcend in ourselves biology and enter into a literal world of the forms. That would be nice, but it seems to be that that's the battleground in relationships, is the unfortunate side of the competitive nature of our biology versus what a lot of people are seeking, as was from the part of the video from yourself, Steve, and you say that men seek the Platonic form literally. That seems like it's far more than just natural selection.
Yeah.
To me.
Yeah. So natural selection is a process which brings about the refinement of the instantiation of Plato.
Yeah.
It is available, which was Pauline's point, wasn't it? It's available.
Yeah.
And Plato believed that it was. That was his intuition. And I'm not suggesting that Plato is 100% right, but his intuition was probably very close to as close as it's possible for us to get as human beings to intuiting what's actually going on at the level that was available to him at that time. So to conjure, should we say, Plato up, is to say that that's a good enough representation of what's likely really happening. But we do, as you say, have to bring that into alignment with Darwin, and they're not actually antagonistic to one another at all. They both serve the same goal, because the problem of being physical and being material means we have to have something like Darwin in order to generate biology to the point where biology can be transcended by information as it moves from Platonic to inorganic to biological to artificial.
I mean,
beyond.
in broad terms, it's mating and relating, isn't it?
It is. It's all about relating.
But you know, the spectrum, you've got the bandwidth of whatever relating is in between. I mean, you know, reproduction is for those who choose it in their relationships is such a small part of that relationship, really. I mean, even the reproductive window for women, sort of late teens to late 20s, early 30s, when you think about the kind of lifespan that women have now, is a very, very small window of time. Obviously, once you have offspring, they're with you, you know, for life. But what I'm saying is that, you know, once the Darwinian side, the Freudian side of things has been fulfilled, it's like, well, what's left then for those people who want more than that?
Yeah.
And then obviously we get into the relating side of things, and some people do not have no desire, no compunction to take relating beyond Freud and Adler. Like I said earlier on, why should they? Really? It's not for everyone, but for those who want the transcendent in their relationships, they have to work for it.
Yeah.
There is no easy way of coming by it other than dealing with things like complexes, which of course they are the battleground, aren't they, in relationships for men and women. They're the in some ways the stuff of relationships. But by taking them on and by working through them and working through the conflict, eventually you can and do reach a point where you can access the Platonic form more easily, more readily, because it's not intruding into your relationship all the time. But you do have to do that. And you know, it can be acquiring that consciousness. It can be quite a shocking thing. It's not, you know, it's not easy. It's hard won. And sometimes it is about endurance, how long you prepare to stay in the fight in order to achieve that consciousness. And whether or not you believe it's worth it in terms of the context of the relationship you have.
So if it's possible to glimpse the forms, which is the way Plato puts it, if you can do that even in the midst of difficulties in a relationship, that can actually sort the complexes out.
Definitely.
So it's not a linear process, because everything is present at the same time.
True.
It's whether we know what is present, whether we're conscious of that, of the superpositioning, and how it can be moved around. And that takes effort, doesn't it?
It's challenging.
It is challenging, but that is the ultimate test.
It is.
I think, to be honest, of us as human beings, is how conscious can we become of the phenomenon that we call superpositioning, which is the presence of all of this in different states simultaneously. Because when we access it, we can solve other things. And if we don't, then we collapse, so to speak, into something which is tolerable, perhaps, or is not. So it's there, it's available, and then that's the ultimate test of character.
It is. How long you prepare to stay there. If you have glimpsed it in the other person, that keeps you in the fight, actually, because you know that at some point it will return, it will be emitted again, it will express itself again, and that's reassurance enough, usually. And maybe at times when it's not possible to experience it fully, or in a way that you might need to, then there is also creativity as well.
There is, and creativity is accessing that which is not the normal ego, the normal consciousness.
You strip away the cognitive ego.
You do, and that's another way of accessing the Platonic forms, through narratives very often, because you know, somebody makes a film or writes a novel, then the mythic process illustrates the instantiation of the Platonic forms through relating. It actually mirrors what we should be doing. The information which creatives accept as coming from outside of them literally does, certainly outside of their ego consciousness, and it provides a solution. That's why all of us pretty much are drawn to some kind of representation of a narrative, even if it's a soap opera or a movie or a video game, wherever it might be. The fundamental elements that move through there are Platonic form illustrations of the ontology of a life set against its complete background. And that's why mystery comes into it, science fiction, anything like that. That's the indication there's something beyond the mere mundanity of everyday life, which is the glimpse of the transcendent that's latent within there. And can we unpack that? And it's the invitation to do so, but not through fantasy, but through a lived life.
Are there any other Platonic forms that you guys have seen that are real? I'm not asking for a list necessarily, but you've spoken on masculine and feminine, but Plato, well, when I've read Plato, he seems to sometimes suggest there's very few, and other times that there's loads and loads and loads of them.
I would think that in a purely informational sense, then there will be many. How many of those are of importance is another matter, because who or what should become conscious of those, and at what point? And I think that's where Aristotle began to diverge a little bit in his concept of the four causes. It's a little bit too reductive and mechanistic, and a lack of personal engagement. There's no doubting Aristotle's intellect, and he's recognized for that. But I think he reacted against Plato instead of following him enough to see where he could actually go further than him. So he was a kind of a compensation, but didn't take him further and could have done. So in that sense, I would say there are an innumerable number of forms, but most of them are not relevant to the problem of consciousness and of existence. But the fundamental ones will be those to do with relating. Now, Plato described it as the love, for example, and the form of the good and that kind of thing. They are huge indicators that there is something transpersonal outside of our normal consciousness that is not biologically reductive alone in that ordinary sense. And they impress upon us, and they've always impressed upon us through different cultural representations. So it's that fundamental task. And I think that the fundamental task of all fundamental tasks is relating, because that keeps the biology going and it also increases consciousness. It fulfills both of those fundamental criteria.
In terms of accessing then these more relational forms, is the fundamental thing that women are going to be up against, in particular, men too, of course, but talking about women, essentially just their own complexes? Is that what's going to be, this is identified complexes, suggestion from the culture, that kind of stuff that's relatively superficial, but pernicious as all hell?
Yes. It truly is, James. And for the reasons that we said earlier, when you get women who hate men in this, they hate themselves really, but it's projected onto men, as I think we say in some of the graphics in the video, that men are therefore responsible for all their suffering or all their woes. That material has to be worked through. There's no way around that really, for women who want to move beyond it if they're still possessed by those kinds of ideas. And it may be that for whatever reason, and these things are always context specific, aren't they, that any given or particular woman cannot give that up because it would just be too difficult to do that. It would be too big an ask or too much of an adaptation for whatever reason. And there's not a lot you can do when things are like that. But I think for women, for example, who they may have been wronged by men, say by a few men, that doesn't mean all men are that way. Just those sort of fine discriminations between ideas are important, because they can unlock you from within and open you up in such a way that you start to live again, and you're receptive to relationships, to men in a healthy way. So it is possible for women to move beyond that, but they do have to put the work in. And it's not always easy, and it takes a lot of fortitude and endurance very often. It does for men and women. I hate this kind of divide, this idea, that there is this thing called feminism. There should be humanism, men and women equally valued. And we move beyond these kinds of discussions immediately when we think in that way. We are all human beings after all.
Completely agree. This might sound slightly instinctually repugnant based on what you've just said, actually, but it's based on something from the narration part of this, where if the Platonic form wasn't there, then men might not bother with relationships at all in this current time.
Yes.
Would it be, and that Platonic belief in that ideal shouldn't be lost by young men, even if they can't currently find it out in the culture.
Yes.
So I think a lot of, and I know that this is absolutely true, a lot of young guys have done so with certain, say, red pill, they're called the red pill people. It's not a very nice, there's no transcendence in it at all, even in a biological sense. It's just women are horrible creatures, and that's that. We essentially have to live in a Freudian and Adlerian world. I imagine lots of people watching this video do not. They just feel on the inside that's not right. In the meantime, while young men out there are waiting for a rebirth of the feminine, would it be advisable for them to attempt to access the Platonic form of the feminine from within themselves? That is, that inherited experience and anticipation of women, and hold it inside like a creative would perhaps have a muse, Would that be advisable, or would it be best for guys to stay away from that kind of thing?
I can see you're edging to respond to that, Steve.
Well,
I'll come back. I'll let you speak and
okay,
I'll come back.
thank you.
Yeah.
First of all, men have to access the masculine Platonic form, and this is where it's not as clear cut as it seems on the surface, because what Jung called the anima is not female psychology. The anima is a part of male psychology. So if a man accesses himself, he will automatically find the anima within himself. And that's the thing then which he thinks exists outside of himself. And that's the goal of that, is to find that in the woman, but it is still inborn, as Jung himself said, as a virtual image inside the man, the anticipation of the feminine. So if a man acts in the best way possible for himself and his own nature, he will then appear to the woman in the right way, the right woman. And it's the same with women. If women want to be the best that they can be, they need to anticipate the best of what a man can be. And then the two can evolve together and to develop together without slogans and top-down Adlerian perversions or anything like that. They will actually get along and things will become positive. And we could move then in terms of consciousness away from Darwinian opposition and selection towards a more spiritual position. So a man has to accept himself first. And when he does, when he finds his own Platonic form of the masculine, it will wear a woman's face. Because the intentionality behind him discovering himself is to meet the feminine, because that is his context. And the reverse is true for women. When women find themselves, they see the masculine element which anticipates them relating to men. But that animus, as Jung called it, is still part of feminine psychology. So it's not as simple as a one-sided collapse into an internal representation. Without the context, there is nothing except collapse into exaggeration, as you said. So without a relationship to the feminine, everything which is supposed to be stereotypically masculine becomes exaggerated and gets fixated at the level of Adler and Freud. And there's no relating at all, not even at a Darwinian level. Then Darwin is triggered. And it's the same with the women. Darwin, when it's triggered in them, will happen when they reject the masculine and the fact that men are their context biologically and informationally. Plato understood that. He intuited that. And that intuition was profound. It may not be complete. It probably isn't. But it's not a bad starting point to see if we can reason out in that Platonic sense what might be going on, so we can understand then why Darwin is necessary to bring Plato into material existence and for it to be sustained.
Did that answer your question, James? Or are you still thinking that there will be men out there struggling to know what to do with their, men who do have the capacity to relate and relate well? It's what can they do in a practical sense about it, Steve, isn't it?
Yeah. See, this is Darwin, you see, because Darwin will be triggered to solve the problem when relating breaks down.
Yes.
And it will do so because it will, unfortunately, he will cull, he being metaphorical, of course, but as a dynamic will cull from the gene pool, those people are not adapted to the purpose of existence.
Yeah.
Which is both biological reproduction and the advancement of consciousness. It's both of those. And the advancement of consciousness is not academic, it is not Jungian thinking function, it is transcendent, transpersonal, it is what we might call otherwise spiritual. That advances consciousness. And that's the informational substrate, which is, it seems, is pushing everything. So men need to be the best example they can be of being a man. Without exaggeration, without becoming Paleolithic in that reductive sense, and women too, because as one changes, it will change the other. It is a field effect. They're not isolated from one another. But where that has been enforced, that this isolation and rejection from the top down, then we predicted, anyone would predict that this could happen, because it's not a difficult thing. That then you'll start to see these selective pressures coming in at the Darwinian level, which then is superposition psychosocially and culturally. And the genome will start to say, this is all going wrong. Let's just throw the switch and see who survives and start again. And then we push consciousness again and again, and we keep going. It's a pulse. We have to realize that however spiritual this thing might be, it does not care about an individual, any of us, unless that we can instantiate it. It seeks instantiation. If we don't do it, we operate only at a biological level, and that means Darwin will operate through us and against us if need be. So there has to be a move towards the spiritual, and it will take good men to provide the best example, and therefore the opportunity for women to see that they're destroying themselves.
Well, yeah,
and vice versa.
Yes, I mean, it doesn't take, I mean, for women to be strong women, it's important that they don't try to emulate men. I mean, there's a quote in the Wounded Woman book, Healing the Father-Daughter Relationship by Linda Schertzy-Leonard, and there's a little passage in there by an American poet called Carolyn Kaiser, and it's worth actually reading the full thing, but it begins by saying, women, do not try to make yourselves ugly by aping the ways of men. And, you know, just in that opening line, it's so instructive about what not to do. And yet we see so much of it in the culture. Women are happy to degrade themselves, it seems, in all sorts of ways, because they think that that's what men do. Well, not all men do that kind of thing. For a start, it's important to point that out. And that is not the way to be a strong woman. It just isn't. And, you know, it's awful, really, in a way, I think, as a woman, seeing how women have been misled about what it means to be a woman and how to be a happy woman and how to be in a good, resonant relationship to men. There have been so many lies told. Yeah. And women have, unfortunately, some women have bought into that. Yeah. And it is destroying them, and it's destroying their relationships. So we have to reframe literally what it means to be a woman. What is femininity, really, as opposed to what we're told it is by the culture.
Yeah, and there are all sorts of commentators on that who provide that kind of context for what's going wrong with culture, but we can see that it's gone wrong. That's really obvious. The correction has to come through individuals, and then individuals who relate properly, and that will generate a field effect which will spread. And it only takes a few % to do that in the right way, and that field strength increases.
I think women can do this, though. I think they can lead the way on it. I mean, empires have risen and fallen on the strength of women's involvement in the culture and in relationships and in their relationships to men. Women have a hugely important part to play in life as a whole. But they need to do that. They need to play their hand properly as strong women and not as pseudo men. It'll never work. No. It's just, like I say, it's the kind of thing that does destroy cultures. And there's plenty of women out there now on the world stage, a lot of them young women, who, half of them you don't know who they are. They just seem to pop up all over the place on, the sort of the political stage. And it's like,
Wotan is wearing a woman's face.
Yes, indeed.
And in true Jungian tradition, not an individual woman, but a collective.
Yes.
Because the animus is collective, not individual. So when Wotan morphs into the feminine, or at least adopts the guise of the feminine, then it will propagate and multiply and appear everywhere in a political way. And that's what's happening. And the proof of that is the West is collapsing. It is collapsing. It's approaching its terminal point. It can be reversed, but it's heading in that way. That's unfortunately blatantly obvious. There's a slow motion nuclear war kicking off in Europe at the moment. Let's stop it if we can.
And it's not men who are doing that either.
No, there's a lot of very, very significant women.
Yes. Yeah. There are.
Who are behind that, particularly in one nation across the pond that's organising this. Without mentioning any names, they're quite easy to find out who they are.
Some of the women that I have in mind are certainly on the surface appear to be so innocuous, but the ideas that they hold and push and promulgate are so dangerous that it could literally wipe us all out.
Yeah. That's a lack of relating.
It is. Yeah. And that's the dark side of the feminine.
It is.
Not the masculine.
Yeah, because men will, unfortunately, because women are the context of men, once women start to turn the energy of a culture in a particular direction, they are drawn to acting on the stage provided by the women. The women could stop all of this. They could, but whilst they're in a catabolic decline, it's just going to accelerate towards the sinkhole of oblivion for everyone. But anyway, that's not the rebirth of the feminine, is it?
No, that comes through the things that we were talking about earlier, about those women who actively engage with this process, raise their own awareness, their own consciousness of what's going on, and decide not to go along with the narrative anymore. And the moment that they do that, everything changes, because they're in a position then to influence other women, as you say, Steve. At that point, it's a numbers game, really.
It is. That's when Darwin kicks in.
It is, yeah.
The following was written by Pauline Richards on how women can bring about a rebirth of the feminine. Women have to address their biology. There is no escaping the fact of it. As Camille Paglia has said, Mother Nature is their greatest obstacle. The meta-instinctual stages of menarche, childbirth and menopause that span a woman's reproductive life are anticipated by the genome and on timed release across lifespan development. Women embody the life cycle of birth, death and rebirth that is fundamental to all living things, and are in that sense superpositioned with the natural world. Collectively, they give life through the birthing of children, but also understand the agony of childbearing, loss through miscarriage, stillbirth, and abortion. Little girls rehearse motherhood ahead of time by playing with dolls or by exhibiting care behaviour more broadly. Some women, whose potential for personal development is modest, are completely contained by their reproductive lives. Their whole lives are geared to becoming mothers and grandmothers. They live for it. Other women find it hard to juggle motherhood with the instinctive pressure to develop themselves, to work or have a career. Instead, some women who are self-supporting do not have a choice in this. They are forced to juggle both. For women with considerable genomic potential, there is always tension between the basic instinct to create life and the need to develop themselves in other ways. There is no easy way around this, and much depends on individual context. In broad terms, it is harder to do everything at once, as there's always the possibility of falling short in one area. In today's culture, female narcissism is such that women have been persuaded that it is possible, even desirable, to have it all. When relationships start to feel the considerable strain of having a family, wanting a career, aspiring to having a designer home, expecting the obligatory annual holiday, women often lash out at men in an accusatory fashion. In many modern families, when the stress reaches flashpoint, women blame men, as required by the culture, for not doing enough domestically, not working hard enough at work, not earning enough money, not understanding what it's like to be a mother, and so on. Men can no more understand what it's like to be a mother than women a father, and moreover, they are not meant to. It is the role of mothers to adequately prepare their daughters for motherhood. Not many women are sufficiently aware just how much they are pushed by their biology into having children, believing themselves to be making a conscious choice. Indeed, there is an observable tripwire around the age of 27 or 28 when women start to feel the urgency to reproduce, if they haven't already done so. Do not identify with deities or fantasy representations of the feminine. Identification leads to reification, and the autosuggestive power is enormous. You may unleash forces that you cannot control, destroying yourself and others in the process. You are not an Amazon simply because you are capable of great physical strength and endurance. You are not a sorcerer because you are gifted with heightened intuition, wise because you are a crone, a goddess because you are blessed with great beauty, or superwoman of any kind. When little girls dress up as princesses, or young women express a desire to find their prince, that is aspirational and entirely normal. What is not adaptive is for young women to identify with the imago in a way that elevates them artificially. The goddess groups that exist today and have their roots in the 1970s second wave feminism encourage narcissism in women on the basis of such an identification. It is important to understand that the imago is merely a representation of a deeper feminine psychodynamic. It is not the thing in and of itself. Women are precious, but no more or less so than in any previous generation. Resist the top-down manipulation from the culture to be easily flattered or chase shiny things, unless it is the light in your beloved's eyes or dappled sunlight on water. Take care of your physical appearance, but do not obsess over it. Take less selfies. Reject significantly altering your appearance through cosmetic procedures. Often the most engaging and alluring women are the ones least engaged with their appearance. They effortlessly exude feminine energy. It is a truism, but feminine beauty shines from within. Women do not have an inner man, particularly of a negative kind. Clarissa Pinkola Estes suggests that, quote, we have a derisive, murderous predator born into us. This is such a dangerous and potentially destructive suggestion. Not only do women not have an inner predator or stalker, but they do not have an inner Nazi, rapist, criminal, or creep either. These are all fantasy representations of an inner ancient dynamic, what we might refer to colloquially as the bad boy today. When women believe this kind of suggestion, the fear it generates unconsciously is often sufficient for them to project the content onto outer men. Then outer men are the Nazis, the predators, the creeps, and so on. It is a representation of our ancestry and evolution through our psychology, a collective memory from a time when life was harsh and brutal, highlighting the tendency for some men to be that way under those conditions. This imago of the masculine is also associated with positive qualities of cunning, resourcefulness, and the ability to acquire resources, so it is both dangerous and fascinating at the same time. The genome intends for us to resonate with such images consciously as a reminder that dangerous men do still exist in the environment. What it does not mean is that a woman has an inner man who is trying to destroy her, or that all outer men are to be feared or condemned as evil, power-ridden psychopaths. To sum everything up, Pauline Richards has written the following: care for others. Be generous of heart without wanting or expecting anything in return. Love and cherish your menfolk. They are the context for your femininity. Do not hate all men because you've been wronged by a few. If you have children, your time is your most precious gift. Share what you have learned about the ways of women with your sisters so that they too can blossom and grow. Be creative and resourceful. Never stop learning. Craft your own life according to your own values. Live simply as your ancestors did. Gather only what you need to nourish mind and body. If you listen carefully, you will hear their chatter as they pick fruits in the forest, men, women, and children. Walk beside them, appreciating nature's bounty, then rest a while together, for they are your kin, and together we share our common humanity. When women are connected to their deepest selves, so too are men, and their children flourish. From the rebirth of the feminine will come the rebirth of the masculine. It is within women's gift to make this happen.